surprising thing to me, particularly I'm on the side in the public service side of the equation now, is that there really is a misunderstanding about the amount of money that union folks make and the things that they get. I mean, people really think that union folks are taking home money in wheelbarrows or what have you, or have undue influence. You know, and I understand the argument on some, you know, the 55-20 thing and, you know, and all of that, and folks being able to retire at 55 and collect until they're 70 or 75. I get that, but I think that unions are getting somewhat of a bad shake here. What do you think, Larry?
I mean, I think the great majority of union members are barely middle class. Certainly the folks in Local 26 do not make a lot of money. The SEIU folks do not make a lot of money, although there are some public employees, public safety employees, especially with overtime, who do very well. The great majority of folks who drive trucks for public works, I mean, some of them may even qualify for food stamps. And the demonizing or demonization of public employees is something which is troublesome to me. But it's a different electorate out there. Yeah. And there are, and Mike grew up in Brighton, I grew up in Dorchester. I'm guessing that on my street, Codman Hill Avenue, Ward 17, Precinct 4, that a third of the people on that street when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, they were either MBTA bus drivers, 589, they were 718 firefighters, they were police officers. My mother was Local 66, Teachers Union. They were people who worked for various other companies like N-Star and the telephone that were all organized. Right. That's not the case today, certainly not in Jamaica Plain where I live, and I doubt that's the case in a lot of neighborhoods in the city. So that if a mayor or somebody running for mayor had even suggested in the very lightest possible way a bad thing about unions, then they were saying something bad about Mr. Conley, who drove the trolley for the tea, or Mrs. DiCara, who was the school teacher, or somebody down the street who was with the fire department. It's very different today. Large numbers of public employees do not live in the city, and that may be one of the reasons why the tone has changed. Tough to tell, never seen any polling data on that, never seen any focus groups, but I think it's a different dynamic.
I agree. I'd like to point to one exemplar, and that's the Boston Teachers Union. They endorsed Felix and Rob Consalvo, and some of the news reports was, well, it's a terrible thing. Why would you ever accept that endorsement? And, you know, when I was a city councilor, I always sought out the endorsement of the Boston Teachers Union. But my dad was, as I said, he was a member of the hotel workers, but he taught at Jamaica Plain High School at the end of his career, and he was involved in the union, and I always sought out that endorsement. I was very proud when I got it. Now it's almost like, well, if you get it, you really don't want to announce it. Well, one of the most, I thought, passionate discussions was Felix Arroyo's explanation of why he's running for mayor. Now, he may not end up in the top two, but his explanation was passionate about who he was looking to support, the hotel workers, the janitors, the SEIU folks. And, you know, Felix said, look, I'd be proud to be the endorsee of these unions. So it's a different time. I agree with Larry.
So, Larry, this negative take on unions, is this going to have a negative effect on Marty?
I think that the Herald was a real sucker punch. And I think that, just from my scuttlebutt, that some of the undecideds may not break for him as a result. That's a gut instinct. Once again, there's no real way to poll and get accurate data except if you have focus groups, and I'm sure the candidates have, but I haven't. But I think it's both his greatest asset and perhaps his greatest liability. And when we're looking at the vote totals on Tuesday at about 8:15, 8:30, when they start coming in, it'll be easy to tell, and Mike and I can probably look at half a dozen sample precincts, and if in a precinct like Ward 7, Precinct 3, Foley Apartments, South Boston, Marty's at 45 or 50%. There's a lot of union people there. A lot of blue-collar people, done very well, own houses. And if, on the other hand, if we take a look at, let's say, Ward 4, where there are almost no union members, I would think, in Ward 4 at this point. South End, maybe a few.
SEIU folks,
maybe a few.
but not
a lot.
Not
a lot. So, I mean, I think it'll be a barometer. I think he's going to probably have more troops on the ground on Tuesday than any other candidate. I could be wrong on that. I think they have ID'd their voters, and I think he's going to be in the hunt till that last vote is counted.
Conversely, do you think, well, before I go to my next question, Mike, did you have something to say about
No, I was going to say, I think the endorsement or non-endorsement of the Herald energized the Walsh base. They just said, we'll
show you?
We'll show them.
Yeah.
We'll show them how, pro-union folks can put it together. And I agree with Larry that they have the most sophisticated get out the vote of all the candidates. Some of the others are good, but Walsh is very sophisticated. They know exactly what they do, and you can say whatever you want about Boston Irish guys. They know how to run municipal campaigns.
Absolutely. We've done it for the rest of the country.
Yeah, that's right.
For about 50, 60 years.
That's right, right. So let me ask you, Larry, what do you think of John Connolly topping every poll? I mean, the consistency with which he stayed on top of at least every poll that I've seen, he stayed in somewhere around 11, 12%.
I'm not surprised at all for a couple of reasons. Number one, he's been raising money for a long time. Number two, he was out of the box first. Number three, he stayed on message.
Yeah.
And he knows what his message is.
Yeah.
And he is quite convinced there are at least 25,000 people who are between 30 and 50, his contemporaries, who are very concerned about education without regard to whether their kids are in the schools, who will stick with him. In JP, this group that I was discussing are mostly people a little bit older. The group that's in their 40s in Jamaica Plain have invited me to house parties for John Connolly. People who are politically active, traditional left, center, JP Democrats who are almost a generation younger than the people who I've known for 40 and 50 years. And therefore, it's not an ideological split, it's a generational split. And I'm told that in Charlestown, the Charlestown Mothers Group, which are mothers who are women mostly, and their husbands in their 30s and 40s are breaking for Connolly. So I think he views that as being his constituency, every place in the city. I think he's run a great campaign. He stayed on message, and he gambled, and it was a big gamble.
Yeah, it was.
And he got out early, while Robbie and Mike and everybody else was just waiting and waiting and waiting. 30 years ago, we had a campaign office open a year before March. We were at it for a long time. And so was Finnegan, and so was Kearney, and so was Mel, and so was Ray. We were going whether Kevin was running again or not.
I got you.
None of these folks, other than John Connolly, were out of the box early. And it takes time to open up the account and put down the deposit for the phone and get a lease because you can't get a headquarters for free anymore, and all the things you have to do.
Right.
And that, while Connolly had done that already, everybody else was doing it in April. And then you had the marathon, and people didn't know whether you could campaign. Meanwhile, Connolly's campaign is operational.
Right.
He's in full gear.
John was running for mayor for 2 full years before everybody else. And the fact that he elected to announce that he was going to run for mayor while Tom Menino was still the mayor gets him grades, gets him points with a lot of folks in the city.
Did he do the right thing with turning down the Stand for Children money?
Did he do the right thing? I would have taken it. I mean, you saw the endorsement. You knew you were going to they were going to run a campaign for you. I would have said, you know what? I saw their endorsement. It was $1 million in the primary. I think it was $1 million in the final. I would have taken it.
Larry, does that money come back in the final?
I don't think it does. I think it was politically smart for him not to take it. And I'm like, Mike, it's tough to say no.
Yeah.
You know, he grew up in Fidelis Way. I grew up in Dorchester. It's tough to say no to that kind of
$1
money.
million is $1 million.
That's right.
And in Dorchester, that's real money.
Yeah, right.
And but it gives him an issue if it's him against Marty Walsh.
Because Marty did
Walsh
have some
is getting
outside
outside money.
Right.
It gives him an issue, a very clear-cut issue. You either take it or you don't take it.
Yeah.
And to some extent, I think that positions him well if it's Connolly Walsh in the final.
So let me ask you, what did you think of the kind of brouhaha around the whole blacks only or black leaders only meeting that was called, where my understanding is, well, I actually heard two stories. One was to see if some of the candidates would consider stepping down. The other side of that I heard was really it was more issues-based, to talk about issues of importance to communities of color. That aside, what do you think about that whole dust-up and how Charlotte deflected that during the televised debate? What do you think about that?
I, as a matter of policy, don't like any meeting where anybody is excluded. For the same reason I don't like the fact that gay folks can't march in the St. Patrick's Day parade. That's the city I worked really hard for, and we're sort of getting there.
Right.
So I personally didn't like the idea. Certainly people have a right to discuss whatever they want. It wasn't a public meeting. It's not a public body. There's no open meeting laws at stake. I think it was an awkward one, especially for Charlotte. I think she did about as well as she could with it. But one thing that the three of us know, and I expect most of our viewers know, the minority community is not monolithic.
That's right.
I mean, Al Smith used to say the only time the Irish stand together is at the reading of the gospel.
Right, right.
And in East Boston, you have state representative contests where you have Neapolitans fighting Sicilians. And sometimes those battles don't go away. So this is a very diverse city. There are people who are from the South. There are people who are from the islands. There are people of color whose families have been here longer than the McCormacks and the DiCaras, and we all know who some of them are. And there are people from Somalia, and people from Nigeria, and there are Dominicans who identify as black, and there are Dominicans who identify as white, and you can, the rest of the show we can talk about all the diversity in the city. So there's no monolithic voice.
What I found interesting, and it was, awkward, I think, for Charlotte to come out and say that, was, I guess, was one of her campaign people who had this
Kevin,
idea.
right?
Kevin Peterson.
Used to work at City Hall.
Yeah, I know who he, I know he is, and what I know about it, I read. But I
He's
thought
a short,
the
smart guy with round glasses.
the endorsement of John Barrows sort of deflated the whole argument that we should all get behind one candidate. That being Charlotte. So, and plus, Charles Yancey's been criticized. Well, Charles has every right to run, and
He's been in office for 30 years.
For 30 years.
And the Yanceys have paid a lot of dues.
Right.
I mean, Alice Yancey, I met Alice Yancey in model cities more than 40 years ago,
okay.
when it wasn't easy being a leader on Savin Street, okay?
Charles is
paid a lot of dues.
Charles is very well-spoken. He's thoughtful. He thinks out the
3 master's
issues.
degrees or something.
Yeah, I know he's a smart. He's a very smart guy. And how do you say to Charles, get out of the race?
Well, let me ask you this now. So Charlotte got into the race a little bit late. She may have been the last one to get into the race. So talk about her trajectory, from the time that she actually got in, getting in late, to really fighting the good fight. She didn't raise as much money as she would have liked to, but she's in there swinging for the fences.
Great.
And she stands an opportunity to get into the final 2. Does that
certainly
bring,
does, yeah.
if she does get in, is it a done deal? Does an African-American woman win because it brings national money and national attention, or does she still have a Donnybrook of a fight, depending upon who's in that final with her?
I think she has a fight. There's no question about it. But it will bring focus, and it will bring a national attention to a race which has been pretty sleepy so far. It really hasn't been an issue-dominated race. But if it's Charlotte versus, pick one, then it becomes much more of a nationally focused race,
And
for
it may
sure.
mean the turnout will spike high. And when the turnout is high, it's much less predictable.
But I've talked to a lot of women lately, and as I saw with Andrea Cabral, when she ran for sheriff, women came out in truck bus loads. I'm telling you. I mean, we had grandmothers, granddaughters, daughters all show up together to say that they were voting for a viable female candidate.
Oh, sure. And you know what? Charlotte versus pick one. It would be, as much as I like John Conley and Dan Conley and Marty Walsh and Rob Consalvo, Charlotte versus any of those folks would be a much more exciting race in the final, for sure.
Yeah. Talk to me about Dan Conley. What do you think?
Danny has people all over the city. He has a big war chest. He's organized. He's the mature candidate among the group. He certainly understands public safety issues. Sadly, we've had a few blips public safety-wise. Danny's always in the picture, legitimately so. He's the DA. I think he'd be a very interesting transitional mayor, just because he's a little bit older, as opposed to somebody who's 40-ish who might be there for 20 years.